Hello, everybody. I hope everybody is doing great. They are excited, they are happy wherever they are because happiness is very important, guys. You have to be happy every single day. I know it's unattainable, but you just have to try all the time and be happy, okay? So remember, I don't know, the 30 of you guys who have been here, you know that I attempted doing this like a year ago, I think, and I just got like really busy and I couldn't carry on with this. But now I'm back because my friend and I made a pact. So I'm currently on this journey of reading books, self-awareness, those type of those type of things. And I've been reading this book, which has been one of the greatest books I've ever came across. And I told my friend, dude, I told my best friend, you have to go and get this book. And like, he's one of those people who's like, I don't have time. And I was like, okay, cool. I know you're always on YouTube, so what's going to happen is that I'm going to shoot a video and read the book, and then you must come and give me a new excuse why you're not reading the book, because I read it for you. I read you the chapter that I feel like it's important, and I feel like it will change anybody's lives, and people who have not come across this book, this chapter will completely change your perspective, how you look at things, and also to be a little bit kind to yourself, and also to take responsibility for your life in general. So this is one of the most important chapters I've ever read, and it has completely changed my mind. So let's get on and stop talking and read this beautiful, gorgeous chapter. The title of the chapter is You Are Always Choosing, right? It says, imagine that somebody puts a gun to your head and tells you that you have to run 26.2 miles in under 5 hours. Or else he'll kill you and your entire family. That would suck. Now imagine that you bought nice shoes and running gear, trained religiously for months, and completed your first marathon with all of your closest family and friends cheering you at the finish line. That could potentially be one of the proudest moments of your life. Exact same 26.2 miles, exact same person running them, exact same pain coursing through the exact same legs. But when you chose it freely and prepared for it, it was a glorious and important milestone in your life. When it was forced upon you against your will, it was one of the most terrifying and painful experiences of your life. Often the only difference between a problem being painful or being powerful is a sense that we choose it and that we are responsible for it. Like, different, they hit differently. When you choose to live the relationship is more powerful than when you are forced to live the relationship. I don't know if that makes sense, jokes aside. If you are miserable in your current situation, chances are it's because you feel like some part of it is outside your control, that there's a problem you have no ability to solve, a problem that was somehow thrust upon you without your choosing. When we feel that we are choosing our problems, we feel empowered. When we feel that our problems are being forced upon us against our will, we feel victimized and miserable. The choice. William James had problems, really bad problems. Although born into a wealthy family and prominent family, from birth, James suffered life-threatening health issues. An eye problem that left him temporarily blinded as a child, a terrible stomach condition that caused excessive vomiting and forced him to adapt an obscure and highly sensitive diet, trouble with his hearing, back spasms so bad that for days at a time he often couldn't sit or stand. Like, Muto was going through that. My mom always laughs when she comes across on TV. I get a stroke, aba shapiwa ke khomo, and then a petwa ke legadima, but a survivor. Like, James was that woman. If you know, I think go af bobo or something like that. Due to his health problems, James spent most of his time at home. He didn't have many friends and he wasn't particularly good at school. Instead, he passed the days painting. That was the only thing he liked and the only thing he felt particularly good at. Unfortunately, nobody else thought he was good at it. When he grew to adulthood, nobody bought his work, and as the years dragged on, his father, a wealthy businessman, began ridiculing him for his laziness and his lack of talent. Meanwhile, his younger brother, Henry James, went on to become a world-renowned novelist. His sister, Alice James, made a good living as a writer as well. William was the family oddball, or what we call the black sheep. In a desperate attempt to salvage the young man's future, James' father used his business connection to get him admitted to Harvard Medical School. It was his last chance, his father told him. If he screwed this up, there was no hope for him. But James never felt at home or at peace at Harvard. Medicine never appealed to him. He spent the whole time feeling like a fake and a fraud. After all, if he couldn't overcome his own problems, how could he ever hope to have the energy to help others with theirs? After touring a psychiatric facility one day, James mused in his diary that he felt he had more in common with the patients than with the doctors. A few years went by, and again, to his father's disapproval, James dropped out of medical school. But rather than deal with the brunt of his father's wrath, he decided to get away, because it's easier to always it's easier to run away from your parents than to listen to them always saying, hey, but that mereko, hey, because it can be a little bit tiring. I see where James was coming from, but I don't see it also. He signed up to join an anthropological expedition to the Amazon rainforest. This was in the 1860s, so transcontinental travel was difficult and dangerous. If you ever played the computer game Origin Trail when you were a kid, it was kind of like that, with the dynasty and drowning oxen and everything. Anyway, James made it all the way to the Amazon, where the real adventure was to begin. Surprisingly, his fragile health held up the whole way. But once he finally made it, on the first day of the expedition, he promptly contracted smallpox and nearly died in the jungle. Then his back spasms returned, painful to the point of making James unable to walk. By this time, he was emaciated and stuffed from the smallpox, immobilized by his bad back, and left alone in the middle of South America, the rest of the expedition having gone on without him. With no clear way to get home, a journey that would take months and likely kill him anyway. But somehow he eventually made it back to the New England, where he was greeted by an even more disappointed father. By this time, the young man wasn't so young anymore, nearly 30 years old, still unemployed, a failure at everything he had attempted, with a body that routinely betrayed him and wasn't likely to ever get better. Despite all the advantages and opportunities he'd been given in life, everything had fallen apart. The only constant in his life seemed to be suffering and disappointment. James fell into a deep depression and began making plans to take his own life, because there are just those people who have been so immersed in pain for the long period of time that it seems like everything that they do is painful and they have to go through all these painful things. I feel like James was one of those people. Everything Jay and Nayetsa was a disappointment in Jay. So sad. But one night, while reading lectures by the philosopher Charles Peirce, James decided to conduct a little experiment. In his diary, he wrote that he would spend 1 year believing that he was 100% responsible for everything that occurred in his life, no matter what. During this period, he would do everything in his power to change his circumstances, no matter the likelihood of failure. If nothing improved that year, then it would be apparent that he was truly powerless to the circumstances around him, and then he would take his own life. The punchline? William James went on to become the father of American psychology. His work has been translated into bazillion languages, and he's regarded as one of the most influential intellectuals, philosophers, psychologists of his generation. He would go on to teach at Harvard. He would go on to teach at Harvard and would world tour much of the United States and Europe giving lectures. He would marry and have 5 children, one of whom, Henry, would become a famous biographer and win a Pulitzer Prize. James would later refer to his little experiment as his rebirth and would credit it with everything that he later accomplished in life. There is a simple realization from which all personal improvement and growth emerges. This is the realization that we individually are responsible for everything in our lives, no matter the external circumstances. We don't always control what happens to us, but we always control how we interpret what happens to us as well as how we respond. Whether we consciously recognize it or not, we are always responsible for our experiences. It's impossible not to be. Choosing to not consciously interpret events in our lives is still an interpretation of the events in our lives. Choosing to not consciously interpret events in our lives is still an interpretation of the events in our lives. Choosing to not respond to the events in our lives is still a response to the events in our lives. Even if you get run over by a clown car and pissed on by a busload of school children, it's still your responsibility to interpret the meaning of the event and choose a response. Whether we like it or not, we are always taking an active role in what's occurring to and within us. We are always interpreting the meaning of every moment and every occurrence. We are always choosing the values by which we live and the metrics by which we measure everything that happens to us. Often the same event can be good or bad depending on the metric we choose to use. The point is, we are always choosing whether we recognize it or not. Always. It comes back to how in reality, there is no such thing as not giving a single fuck. It's impossible. We must all give a fuck about something. To not give a fuck about anything is still to give a fuck about something. The real question is, what are we choosing to give a fuck about? What values are we choosing to base our actions on? What metrics are we choosing to use to measure our life? And are those good choices, good values, and good metrics? The responsibility of fault fallacy. Years ago, when I was much younger and stupider, I wrote a blog post, and at the end of it, I said something like, and as a great philosopher once said, with great power comes great responsibility. It sounded nice and authoritative. I couldn't remember who had said it, and my Google search had turned up nothing, but I stuck it in there anyway. It fit the post nicely. About 10 minutes later, the first comment came in. I think the great philosopher you are referring to is Uncle Ben from the movie Spider-Man. As another great philosopher once said, with great power comes great responsibility. The last words of Uncle Ben before a thief whom Peter Parker let get away murders him on a sidewalk full of people for absolutely no explicable reason. That great philosopher. Still, we've all heard the quote. It gets repeated a lot, usually ironically, and after about 7 years. It's one of those perfect quotes that sound really intelligent, and yet it's basically just telling you what you already know, even if you've never quite thought about the matter before. With great power comes great responsibility. It is true, but there's a better version of this quote. A version that actually is profound, and all you have to do is switch the nouns around. With great responsibility comes great power. The more we choose to accept responsibility in our lives, the more power we will exercise over our lives. Accepting responsibility for our problems is thus the first step to solving them. I once knew a man who was convinced that the reason no woman would date him was because he was too short. He was educated, interesting, and good looking, a good catch in principle, but he was absolutely convinced that women found him too short to date. And because he felt that he was too short, he didn't often go out and try to meet women. The few times he did, he would hone in on the smallest behaviors from any woman he talked with that could possibly indicate he wasn't attractive enough for her, and then convince himself that she didn't like him, even if she already did. As you can imagine, his dating life sucked. What he didn't realize was that he had chosen the value that was hurting him, height. Women he assumed are attracted only to height. He was screwed no matter what he did. This choice of value was disempowering. It gave this man a really crappy problem. Not being tall in love in a world meant, in his view, for tall people. There are far better values that he could have adopted in his dating life. I want to date only women who like me for who I am might have been a nice place to start. A metric that assesses the values of honesty and acceptance. But he did not choose these values. He likely wasn't even aware that he was choosing his value, or could do so. Even though he didn't realize it, he was responsible for his own problems. Despite that responsibility, he went on complaining, "But I don't have a choice," he would tell the bartender. "There's nothing I can do. Women are superficial and vain and will never like me." Yes, it's every single woman's fault for not liking a self-pitying, shallow guy with shitty values, honestly. Obviously, a lot of people hesitate to take responsibility for their problems because they believe that to be responsible for your problem is to be at fault for your problem. Responsibility and fault often appear together in our society or culture, but they are not the same thing. If I hit you with my car, I am both at fault and likely legally responsible to compensate you in some way. Even if hitting you with my car was an accident, I am still responsible. This is the way fault works in our society. If you fuck up, you're on the hook for making it right, and it should be that way. But there are also problems that we aren't at fault for, yet we are responsible for them. For example, if you woke up one day and there was a newborn baby on your doorstep, it would not be your fault that the baby had been put there, but the baby would now become your responsibility. You would have to choose what to do, and whatever you ended up choosing, keeping it, getting rid of it, ignoring it, fitting it to a pit bull, there would be problems associated with your choice, and you would be responsible for those as well. Judges don't get to choose their cases. When a case goes to court, the judge assigned to it did not commit the crime, was not a witness to the crime, and was not affected by the crime, but he or she is still responsible for the crime. The judge must then choose the consequences. He or she must identify the metric against which the crime will be measured and make sure that the chosen metric is carried out. We are responsible for experiences that aren't our fault all the time. This is a part of life. Bagit. Here's one way to think about the distinction between the two concepts. Fault is past tense, responsibility is present tense. Fault results from choices that have already been made. Responsibility results from the choices you are currently making every second of every day. You are choosing to read this as you are choosing to listen to me right now. You are choosing to think about the concept. You are choosing to accept or reject the concept. It may be my fault that you think my ideas are lame, but you are responsible for coming to your own conclusions. It's not your fault that I chose to write this sentence, but you are still responsible for choosing to read it or not. There's a difference between blaming someone else for your situation and that person actually being responsible for your situation. Nobody else is ever responsible for your situation but you. Hey, guys. Nobody is ever responsible for your situation but you. Nobody. You are responsible for your situation. Many people may be to blame for your unhappiness, but nobody is ever responsible for your unhappiness but you. They may be to blame for your unhappiness, but they are not responsible for your unhappiness. You are. This is because you always get to choose how to see things, how to react to things, how you value things. You always get to choose the metric by which you measure your experiences. I was thinking, we find a lot of content creators coming on social media and crying about people being mean to them, right? I'm going to put out this video. Not everybody's going to like this video, genuinely. And you have to be okay with it. You have to interpret the comments that come your way. If you interpret it in a way, you're good to your people hate me, and then start feeling sorry for yourself, that's exactly how you're going to feel for the next 24 hours. But if you interpret it like, actually, this person decided to misunderstand me, and he or she decided to take my whatever it is that I put out and make a spectacle out of it, even though I didn't mean it like that, you're going to have peace in your heart knowing that I did not mean this thing in any malicious way. They chose, wherever they are, to interpret it this way. So it's not going to affect me. So I don't understand how people keep on affecting themselves by, especially strangers. Hey, anyway, that's a topic for another day. Sila, manje sila. Where were we? This is because you always get to choose how you see things, how you react to things, how you value things. You always get to choose the metric by which you measure your experiences. My first girlfriend dumped me in a spectacular fashion. She was cheating on me with her teacher. It was awesome. And by awesome, I mean it felt like getting punched in the stomach about 253 times. To make things worse, when I confronted her about it, she promptly left me for him. 3 years together, down the toilet, just like that. I was miserable for months afterwards. That was to be expected. but I also held her responsible for my misery, which, take it from me, didn't get me very far. It just made my misery worse. It's that thing of waiting for a sorry from somebody who's not gonna come. You're gonna sit there. See, I couldn't control her, no matter how many times I called her, or screamed at her, or begged her to take me back, or made surprise visits to her place, or did other creepy and irrational ex-boyfriend things. I could never control her emotions and her actions. Ultimately, while she was to blame for how I felt, she was never responsible for how I felt. I was. At some point, after enough tears and alcohol, my thinking began to shift, and I began to understand that although she had done something horrible to me, she could be blamed for that. It was now my responsibility to make myself happy again, because guys, heartbreaks are so painful. She was never going to pop up and fix things for me. I had to fix them for myself. When I took that approach, a few things happened. First, I began to improve myself. I started exercising and spending more time with my friends whom I had been neglecting. I started deliberately meeting new people. I took a big study abroad trip and did some volunteer work, and slowly I started to feel better. I still resented my ex for what she had done, but at least now I was taking responsibility for my own emotions. And by doing so, I was choosing better values. Values aimed at taking care of myself, learning to feel better about myself, rather than aimed at getting her to fix what she had broken. Yo! By the way, this whole holding her responsible for my emotions, this is probably part of why she left me in the first place. More on that in a couple of chapters, which I'm not going to read. Then, about a year later, something funny began to happen. As I looked back on our relationship, I started to notice problems I had never noticed before. Problems that I was to blame for and that I could have done something to solve. I realized that it was likely that I hadn't been a great boyfriend, and that people don't just magically cheat on somebody they've been with unless they are unhappy for some reason. I'm not saying that this excused what my ex did. Not at all. But recognizing my mistakes helped me to realize that I perhaps hadn't been the innocent victim I'd believed myself to be. That I had a role to play in enabling the shitty relationship to continue for as long as it did. After all, people who date each other tend to have similar values. And if I dated somebody with shitty values for that long, what did that say about me and my values? I learned the hard way that if people in relationships are selfish and doing hurtful things, it's likely you are too, you just don't realize it. In hindsight, I was able to look back and see warning signs of my ex-girlfriend's character, signs I had chosen to ignore or brush off when I was with her, because we do that in relationships, hey? Like, we just choose not to tell people about their shitty behaviors because, like, we love them, we don't want to hurt them, and we ignore them for, like, the longest time, which then becomes a problem when the relationship carries on. I had chosen to ignore or brush off when I was with her. That was my fault. I could look back and see that I hadn't exactly been the boyfriend of the year to her either. In fact, I had often been cold and arrogant towards her. Oftentimes I took her for granted and blew her off and hurt her. These things were my fault too. Did my mistakes justify her mistake? No, but still, I took on the responsibility of never making those same mistakes again and never overlooking the same signs again, to help guarantee that I will never suffer the same consequences again. I took on the responsibility of striving to make my future relationships with women that much better. And I'm happy to report that I have. No more cheating girlfriends leaving me. No more 253 stomach punches. I took responsibility for my problems and improved upon them. I took responsibility for my role in that unhappy relationship and improved upon it with later relationships. And you know what? My ex leaving me, while one of the most painful experiences I've ever had, was also one of the most important and influential experiences of my life. I'm currently going through. Hey, yay, hey! I credit it with inspiring a significant amount of personal growth. I learned from that single problem that dozens of my successes combined. I learned. Hey guys, sorry, it's not about me. I learned more from that single problem than dozens of my success combined. We all love to take responsibility for success and happiness. Hell, we often fight over who gets to be responsible for success and happiness. But taking responsibility for our problems is far more important, because that's where the real learning comes from. That's where the real life improvement comes from. To simply blame others is only to hurt yourself. And also, like, kidding. It's default to blame other people. Hey, Korea, when you did this and that and you hurt me and whatever. But honestly, it hurts more than when you actually take responsibility to bring yourself back to your happy self. Like, eh. And then they say responding to tragedy. But what about really awful events? A lot of people can get on board with taking responsibility for work-related problems and maybe watching too much TV when they should really be playing with their kids or being productive. But when it comes to horrible tragedies, they pull the emergency cord on the responsibility train and get off when it stops. Some things just feel too painful for them to own up to. But to think about it, the intensity of the event doesn't change the underlying truth. If you get robbed, say, you are obviously not at fault for being robbed. No one would ever choose to go through that. But as with the baby on your doorstep, you are immediately thrust into responsibility for a life and death situation. Do you fight back? Do you panic? Do you freeze up? Do you tell the police? Do you try to forget it and pretend it never happened? These are all choices and reactions you are responsible for making or rejecting. You didn't choose the robbery, but it's your responsibility to manage the emotional and psychological and legal fallout of the experience. In 2008, the Taliban took control of the Swat Valley, a remote part of northern Pakistan. They quickly implemented their Muslim extremist agenda. No television, no films, no women outside the house without a male escort, no girls attending school. By 2009, an 11-year-old Pakistan girl named Malala Yousafzai had begun to speak out against the school burn. She continued to attend her local school, risking both her and her father's lives. She also attended conferences in nearby cities. She wrote online, "How dare the Taliban take away my right for education?" In 2012, at the age of 14, she was shot in the face as she rode the bus from home. As she rode the bus home from school one day. A masked Taliban soldier armed with a rifle boarded the bus and asked, "Who is Malala? Tell me, or I will shoot everyone here." Malala identified herself, an amazing choice in and of itself, and the man shot her in the head in front of all the other passengers. Malala went into a coma and almost died. The Taliban stated publicly that if she somehow survived the attempt, they would kill both her and her father. Today, Malala is still alive. She still speaks out against violence and oppression towards women in Muslim countries, now as a best-selling author. In 2014, she received the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts. It would seem that being shot in the face only gave her a larger audience and more courage than before. It would have been easy for her to lie down and say, "I can't do anything," or "I have no choice." That ironically would still have been her choice, but she chose the opposite. What a brave young little girl. A few years ago, I have written about some of the ideas in this chapter on my blog. And a man left a comment. He said that I was shallow and superficial, adding that I had no real understanding of life's problems or human responsibility. He said that his son had recently died in a car accident. He accused me of not knowing what true pain was, and said that I was an asshole for suggesting that he himself was responsible for the pain he felt over his son's death. This man had obviously suffered pain much greater than most people ever have to confront in their lives. He didn't choose for his son to die, nor was it his fault that his son died. The responsibility for coping with that loss was given to him, even though it was clearly and understandably unwanted. But despite all that, he was still responsible for his own emotions, beliefs, and actions. How he reacted to his son's death was his own choice. Pain of one sort or another is inevitable for all of us, but we get to choose what it means to and for us. Even in claiming that he had no choice in the matter and simply wanted his son back, he was making a choice, one of many he would have chosen to use that pain. Of course, I didn't say any of this to him. I was too busy being horrified and thinking that yes, perhaps I was way in over my head and had no idea what the fuck I was talking about. That's a hazard that comes with my line of work, a problem that I chose, and a problem that I was responsible for dealing with. At first, I felt awful, but then after a few minutes, I began to get angry. His objections had little to do with what I was actually saying. I told myself, and what the hell, just because I don't have a kid who died doesn't mean I haven't experienced terrible pain myself. But then I actually applied my own advice. I chose my problems. I could get mad at this man and argue with him, try to outpain him with my own pain, which would just make us both look stupid and insensitive. Or I could choose a better problem. working on practicing patience, understanding my readers better, and keeping that man in mind every time I wrote about pain and trauma from then on. And that's what I've tried to do. I replied simply that I was sorry for his loss and left it at that. What else can I say? Genetics and the hand we are dealt. In 2013, the BBC rounded up half a dozen of teenagers with obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, and followed them as they attended intensive therapies to help them overcome their unwanted thoughts and repetitive behaviors. There was Imogen, a 17-year-old girl who had a compulsive need to tap every surface she walked past. If she failed to do so, she was flooded with horrible thoughts of her family dying. There was Josh, who needed to do everything with both sides of his body. Shake a person's hand with both his right and his left hand, eat his food with each hand, step through a doorway with both feet, and so on. If he didn't equalize his two sides, he suffered from severe panic attacks. And then there was Jack, a classic germaphobe who refused to leave his house without wearing gloves, boiled all his water before drinking it, and refused to eat food not cleaned and prepared by him. OCD is a terrible neurological and genetic disorder that cannot be cured. At best, it can be managed. And as we'll see, managing the disorder comes down to managing one's values. The first thing the psychiatrists on this project do is to tell kids that they are to accept the imperfections of their compulsive desires. What that means, as one example, is that when Imogen becomes flooded with horrible thoughts of her family dying, she's to accept that her family may eventually die and that there's nothing she can do about it. Simply put, she's told that what happens to her is not her fault. Josh is forced to accept that over the long term, equalizing all of his behaviors to make them symmetrical is actually destroying his life more than occasional panic attacks would. And Jack is reminded that no matter what he does, germs are always present and always infecting him. The goal is to get the kids to recognize that their values are not rational, that in fact their values are not even theirs, but rather are the disorders, and that by fulfilling these irrational values, they are actually harming their ability to function in life. The next step is to encourage the kids to choose a value that is more important than their OCD value and to focus on that. For Josh, it's the possibility of not having to hide his disorder from his friends and family all the time. The prospect of having a normal, functional social life. For Imogen is the idea of taking control over her own thoughts and feelings and being happy again. And Jack is the ability to leave his house for long periods of time without suffering traumatic episodes. With these new values held front and center in their minds, the teenagers set out on intensive desensitization exercises that force them to live out their new values. Panic attacks ensue, tears are shed, Jack punches an array of inanimate objects and then immediately Panic attack ensues, tears are shed, Jack punches an array of inanimate objects and then immediately washes his hands. But by the end of the documentary, major progress has been made. Imogen no longer needs to tap every surface she comes across. She says, there are still monsters in the back of my mind, and there probably always will be, but they're getting quieter now. Imogen. Josh is able to go periods of 25 to 30 minutes without equalizing his behaviors between both sides of his body. And Jack, who makes perhaps the most improvement, is actually able to go out restaurants and drinks out of bottles and glasses without washing them first. Jack sums up well what he learned. I didn't choose this life. I didn't choose this horrible, horrible condition, but I get to choose how to live with it. I have to choose how to live with it. A lot of people treat being born with a disadvantage, whether OCD or small stature or something very different, as though they were screwed out of something highly valuable. They feel that there's nothing they can do about it, so they avoid responsibility of their situation. They figure, I didn't choose my crappy genetics, so it's not my fault if things go wrong. And it's true, it's not their fault, but it's their responsibility. Back in college, I had a bit of a delusional fantasy of becoming a professional poker player. I won money and everything, and it was fun. But after almost a year of serious play, I quit. The lifestyle of staying up all night staring at a computer screen, winning thousands of dollars one day and then losing most of it the next wasn't for me. And it wasn't exactly the most healthy or emotionally stable means of earning a living. But my time playing poker had a surprisingly profound influence on the way I see life. The beauty of poker is that while luck is always involved, luck doesn't dictate the long-term results of the game. A person can get dealt terrible cards and beat someone who was dealt great cards. Sure, the person who gets dealt great cards has a higher likelihood of winning the hand, but ultimately, the winner is determined by, yep, you guessed it, the choices the player makes throughout play. I see life in the same terms. We all get dealt cards. Some of us get better cards than others, and while it's easy to get hung up on our cards and feel we got screwed over, the real game lies in the choices we make with those cards, the risks we decide to take, and the consequences we choose to live with. Yeah, it's like other people were born in like very disadvantaged backgrounds, and then others not so disadvantaged. But you will find a person from a disadvantaged background doing better than a guy who grew up because they chose to make better choices and they chose to not feel sorry for themselves and be like, yo, nah, papa kontahlilo, stuff like that. And they then made something out of themselves. So I think that's what he's trying to say. Or he's saying, not trying to say. I see life. I don't know. I'll read again. I see life in the same terms. We all get dealt cards. Some of us get better cards than others, and while it's easy to get hung up on our cards and feel we got screwed over, the real game lies in the choices we make with those cards, the risks we decide to take, the consequences we choose to live with. People who consistently make the best choices in the situations they are given are the ones who eventually come out ahead in poker, just as in life. And it's not necessarily the people with the best cards. These are those there are those who suffer psychologically and emotionally from neurological and or genetic deficiencies. But this changes nothing. Sure, they inherited a bad hand and are not to blame, no more than the short guy wanting to get a date is to blame for being short, or the person who got robbed is to blame for being robbed, but it's still their responsibility. Whether they choose to seek psychiatric treatment, undergo therapy, or do something, the choice is ultimately theirs to make. There are those who suffer through bad childhoods. There are those who are abused and violated and screwed over physically, emotionally, financially. They are not to blame for their problems and their hindrances, but they are still responsible, always responsible, to move on despite their problems and to make the best choices they can, given their circumstances. And let's be honest here. If you were to add up all of the people who have some psychiatric disorder, struggle with depression or suicidal thoughts, have been subjected to neglect or abuse, have dealt with tragedy or death of a loved one, and have survived serious health issues, accidents, or trauma. If you were to round up all of those people and put them in one room, well, you'd probably have to round up everyone. Because nobody makes it through life without collecting a few scars on the way out. Oh my goodness. Sure, some people get settled with worse problems than others, and some people are legitimately victimized in horrible ways. But as much as this may upset us or disturb us, it ultimately changes nothing about the responsibility equation of our individual situation. Victimhood check. The responsibility of fault fallacy allows people to pass off the responsibility for solving their problems to others. This ability to alleviate responsibility through blame gives people a temporary high and a feeling of moral righteousness. Unfortunately, one side effect of the internet and social media is that it's become easier than ever to push responsibility for even the tiniest of infractions onto some other group or person. In fact, this kind of public blame or shame game has become popular. In certain crowds, it's even seen as cool. The public sharing of injustices garners far more attention and emotional outpouring than most other events on social media, rewarding people who are able to perpetually feel victimized with ever-growing amounts of attention and sympathy. Victimhood check is installed on both the right and the left today, among both the rich and the poor. In fact, this may be the first time in human history that every single demographic group has felt unfairly victimized simultaneously, and they are all riding the highs of the moral indignations that comes along with it. Right now, anyone who is offended by anything, whether it's the fact that a book about racism was assigned in a university class or that Christmas trees were burned at a local mall, or the fact that taxes were raised half a percentage on investment funds feels as though they are being oppressed in some way and therefore deserve to be outraged and to have a certain amount of attention. The current media environment both encourages and perpetuates these reactions because, after all, it's good for business. The writer and media commentator Ryan Holiday refers to this as outrage porn. Rather than the report on real stories and real issues, the media find it much easier and more profitable to find something mildly offensive, broadcast it to a wide audience, generate outrage, and then broadcast that outrage back across the population in a way that outrages yet another part of the population. Hey, this triggers a kind of echo of bullshit pinging back and forth between two imaginary sides, meanwhile distracting everyone from real societal problems. It's no wonder we are more politically polarized than ever before. The biggest problem with victimhood check is that it sucks attention away from actual victims. It's the boy who cried wolf. The more people there are who proclaim themselves victims over tiny infractions, the harder it becomes to see who the real victims are. People get addicted to feeling offended all the time because it gives them a high. Being self-righteous and morally superior feels good. As political cartoonist Tim Kreider put it in the New York Times op-ed, outrage is like a lot of other things that feel good but over time devour us from the inside out. And it's even more insidious than most vices because we don't even consciously acknowledge that it's a pleasure. But part of living in a democracy and free society is that we all have to deal with views and people we don't necessarily like. That's simply the price we pay. You could even say it's the whole point of the system. And it seems more and more people are forgetting. Yeah. I don't know what my laptop was doing, sorry. And it seems more and more people are forgetting that. We should pick our battles carefully while simultaneously attempting to empathize a bit with the so-called enemy. We should approach the news and media with a healthy dose of skepticism and avoid painting those who disagree with us with a broad brush. We should prioritize values of being honest, fostering transparency, and welcoming doubt over the values of being right, feeling good, and getting revenge. These democratic values are harder to maintain amidst the constant noise of a networked world, but we must accept the responsibility and nurture them regardless. The future stability of our political system may depend on it. Yo. It's raining! It's drizzling! Wow! I see, I did not Jehovah. We need it. We need it like we need healthy relationships. There is no how. A lot of people might hear all this and then say something like, okay, but how? I get that my values suck and that I avoid responsibility for all my problems and that I'm an entitled little shit who thinks the world should revolve around me and every inconvenience I experience. But how do I change? And to this I say, in my best Yoda impersonation, do or do not, there is no how. You are always choosing, in every moment of every day, what to give a fuck about. So change is as simple as choosing to give a fuck about something else. It really is that simple. It's just not easy. Okay, it really is that simple. It's just not easy. It's not easy because you're going to feel like a loser, a fraud, a dumb ass at first. You're going to be nervous. You're going to freak out. You may get pissed off at your wife or your friends or your father in the process. These are all the side effects of changing your values, of changing the facts you are giving, but they are inevitable. It's simple, but really, really hard. Let's look at some of these side effects. You are going to feel uncertain and guaranteed. Should I really give this up? Is this the right thing to do? Giving up a value you've depended on for years is going to feel disorienting, as if you really don't know right from wrong anymore. This is hard, but it's normal. Next, you'll feel like a failure. You've spent half your life measuring yourself by that old value. So when you change your priorities, change your metrics, and stop behaving in the same way, you'll fail to meet that old, trusted metric and thus immediately feel like some sort of fraud or nobody. This is normal and also uncomfortable. And certainly you will weather rejections. Many of the relationships in your life were built around the values you've been keeping. So the moment you change those values, the moment you decide that studying is more important than partying, that getting married and having a family is more important than rampant sex, that working a job you believe in is more important than money, your turnaround will reverberate out through your relationships. Many of them will blow up in your face. This too is normal, and this too will be uncomfortable. This necessary, though painful, side effect of choosing to place your facts elsewhere, in a place far more important and more worthy of your energies. As you reassess your values, you will be met with internal and external resistance along the way. More than anything, you will feel uncertain. You will wonder if what you are doing is wrong. But as we'll see, this is a good thing. So that's where our chapter ends. So yeah, guys, I hope this was helpful, and I hope you actually enjoyed it. I actually enjoyed reading this. Like recently, actually for the past year, I used to sit with a very good friend of mine, and we would read scripts and stuff like that. So this reminded me of those moments. So that was really nice. I really enjoyed it. I hope you guys get into the habit of reading, guys. It's very important. I'm gonna start on Will soon. And I hope I get like a beautiful chapter that I'm gonna read again. But I really enjoyed this, and I hope you enjoyed it too. So have yourself a beautiful day. I hope you listen to me as you go to work. And my best friend who I did this for, if that sucker does not listen to this, I swear to God, I'm gonna do something. So yeah, thank you so much for being here and for listening, guys. I truly, truly appreciate it. But remember, you chose to be here. Nah? You're gonna choose to either comment or not comment. That's up to you. Even though it will be my responsibility to interact with it, I'll tell you now, I'm not going to be offended by any of the things you say, because, I mean, I don't even know you. You are a stranger sitting wherever you're sitting. If you decide to come here and tell me nonsense, I'm not going to be affected by it. Mina, I don't care. I genuinely don't care about people that come on social media to intentionally hurt other people. I'm not going to be affected by that. Just in jail. Like, people must know when they come to this channel that I, Nazal Naluha, is not going to be affected by stupid people who are failing at their lives, and then they're coming here to come and try to offend me and see my reaction. Nah, I ain't gonna do that. And I hope nobody ever comes to social media and feel the need to like be hurt by strangers. Guys, hey. Don't do that to yourself. So yeah, guys, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you. Good night or good day or whatever. Thank you. Many of them